Alright, Nathaniel Drew made this video about whether it's better to live in the US or in Europe. And naturally, as an American who recently studied abroad in Europe, this reminded me of some gripes I have. Nathaniel Drew spent 19 years living in the US and 5 years living in Europe. I spent the majority of my life living in the US, significant amounts of time in India, and most recently spent 5 months studying abroad in Europe. While 5 months is nothing compared to 5 years, I would say that combining my time abroad in India with my time in Europe and the fact that I grew up with immigrant parents, the international side of my perspective is nothing to overlook. Overall, I think Nathaniel Drew did a good job of not making too many generalizations in his video, and I agree with most of his specific articulations, but there's a lot left unsaid in his video, so I'm here to add my perspective. One point Nathaniel Drew made was that a lot of Europeans think that the US lacks culture. This is something I heard a lot while I was abroad, despite most young people around me liking American music and movies. I agree with Nathaniel Drew that America is one of the biggest cultural exporters in the world, but Europeans aren't talking about that kind of culture. Nathaniel said, Europeans take pride in cultural density. Well, if you want cultural density or diversity, just go to any major American city, New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, or even some states. Texas, North Carolina, Florida, they all have their own ethnic enclaves. So America has cultural density in metropolitan and non-metropolitan areas. Even just Brooklyn has different neighborhoods full of different communities from different parts of the world. There are Dominican neighborhoods, Chinatowns, Little Indias, historically black neighborhoods, basically different neighborhoods with a majority of people from different parts of the world. So that statement about cultural density, I heard it a lot while I was abroad, and it was really funny coming from a majority of people who were white, who had grown up in a majority white continent, speaking to a person of color who admittedly grew up in a majority white country, but there is significantly more racial diversity in the US than in Europe. The methodology of race and ethnicity data collection is so complicated, but in this case, what I was talking about is the presence of different races and ethnicities in both America and Europe. The data of race demographics in the US is widely available, but in some European countries, this kind of data collection is actually banned. This map from 2013 is outdated, but it gives one measure of how diversity works, and concludes that overall, the US is more ethnically diverse than Europe. The UK is one country that does do data collection and is considered one of the most diverse countries in Europe racially, yet it's still not as diverse as the US. Diversity comes in so many forms, but at face value, it's what people look like, in which case, the US is more racially diverse than Europe. Both continents have immigrants too, which increases perspectives, but the immigrants in the US come from places that are further away. So in a sense, it's more difficult to immigrate to a country where you have to fly to move there, rather than 4 countries over where you could take a train to. It's not that Europeans lack culture, it's that their culture is mostly coming from one place, from one continent, whereas in the US, our cultures are coming from everywhere. For some Europeans, America is lacking
customs and traditions that have been passed down for generations. The different regional dishes that come from centuries ago. I'm talking about the superstitions or the different card games or the celebrations that take place that commemorate something that happened before modern day France or Austria or Italy even existed.
There are cultures in the US that have existed for centuries, like Black American and Mexican American cultures. When you think of American, it isn't the first thing you think of, despite these communities being built into the bedrock of our nation. But you can feel how American these people are when you talk to them, even if it's not in your history textbook. They survived here even when America didn't want them. And does it really make a culture less valuable if it's a newer one? I like to believe that it's because these immigrants have had such a hard time coming here and staying here that they're so attached to their first culture. So they bring it here, mix it up, and create new ones. And I think that's what makes America beautiful. You could experience so many cultures without going too far if you're in the right place. There are a lot of things wrong with America, even New York. Institutional racism, a lack of meritocracy at times, unaffordable housing, but it's not like those problems don't exist everywhere else too. And there are cultural deserts, but I'm not giving up my American passport for anything. I'm bringing my centuries-old South Asian customs to the US. I learned dance growing up, which is distinctly South Asian American, not just a South Asian thing. I celebrate Diwali, I choose cake in other people's face on my birthday. I take pride in the subcontinent's rich history and culture, practice hating on the British monarchy even though brown moms love Diana. As American comedian Hassan Minaj said, "We popped out here. We won the lottery." Just because my traditions are traveled ones doesn't make them less interesting or less authentic than the ones that have existed in the same place for centuries. I'm not someone who thinks being American is so central to their identity, even though evidently it is, and I think that's one of the most Gen Z American things ever. Because like Nathaniel Drew once said about himself, I wasn't into the mainstream stereotypical American things like the Super Bowl, the 4th of July, Thanksgiving.
I didn't play American football or baseball. I never watched a Super Bowl final. I didn't go to prom.
But American football wasn't always the most popularly watched American sport. Culture is constantly changing. There's a really good quote from Mohsin Hamid's book, The Reluctant Fundamentalist, that I think might help you understand my perspective a little better. So for context, Mohsin Hamid grew up in Lahore, Pakistan, and has lived in New York, London, and California. His main character said, "In a subway car, my skin would typically fall in the middle of the color spectrum. On street corners, tourists would ask me for directions. I was, in 4.5 years, never an American. I was immediately a New Yorker." I feel more like a New Yorker than an American because in my head, there's more room for the brown side of me in the New Yorker label than in the American label, but I think I'm wrong. I'm evidence that you can be both and more. When I was abroad, most people saw me as American, although some people could only see me as brown, which the two are not mutually exclusive. Even if you don't watch the Super Bowl, even if you don't celebrate the 4th of July, even if your parents weren't born here. And to me, to be an immigrant or have immigrant roots is the most American thing of all. We are Americana. So don't tell me America lacks culture. We have so many cultures from everywhere right here, and we're constantly mixing and creating new ones. I'd like to think that my experience growing up here has led me to have interest in other people's cultures and also led me to teach them about my own. My friend recently, who's not of South Asian descent but had lived in Delhi for a couple of years, said she wanted to learn Hindi, and I told her all you have to do is move into my home and you'll learn Hindi. That has literally happened with a childhood friend of mine. She even learned to eat roti with one hand. It's like the customs of the US don't exist in our home. So another critique Nathaniel Drew had about living in the US was the lack of languages.
Overall, English would do the job in the US.
Yes, English is the dominant language here, and not every place in the US has language diversity. So in his video, he only compares the US and Europe, which is totally fine because that's his experience. But I'm going to tell you about a place you may have heard of called the Indian subcontinent, where my family history lies. As you travel throughout the subcontinent, you're going to encounter languages that aren't even from the same language family tree. There are going to be hundreds of them. I read this article from the New York Times where linguist Zhang Hongming stated that the degree of difference among dialects in China is much higher than the degree of difference among European languages, even though they're not from the same country. So just because two people are from two different countries, it doesn't mean their languages are necessarily that different in Europe. The immigrants in the US come from everywhere, and they bring their languages with them, enriching our culture. So when I walked on the street in New York, there are definitely languages I don't recognize and I don't speak or understand. But that isn't the case in every place in the US. Actually, it's not the case in every place in Europe either. Despite learning Castilian Spanish in school for years, I actually had a lot of trouble understanding the Spanish accent when I went to Santiago de Compostela in Spain this past summer to study abroad. Because in New York, you're way more likely to be exposed to Dominican Spanish, Mexican Spanish, Puerto Rican Spanish, or just Spanglish. Recently, I was speaking to someone in New York and she was asking me, how good is your Spanish? Because in her words, todo el mundo habla español aquí. And what she's saying is that your Spanish must be so good because you're constantly surrounded by it. And to her point, Spanish speakers ask me for directions in New York all the time because they have no doubt that I'm from here. They don't even ask if I speak Spanish. They expect me to know it, even though they believe I'm American. And the funniest part is I'm not from a Spanish-speaking family. I'm not Latin American, but to me, as a New Yorker, as an American, it's important to know Spanish, and it's fun. You get to immerse yourself in different cultures all in the same place. And because I speak Hindi, I'm a part of multiple worlds all right here in the US. And this was before I studied abroad in Europe. Of course, my perspective is going to be New York centric because that's where I'm from. But my parents are from India. So when you step into my home, you leave your English and your shoes at the door. And the thing is, the borders are closer together in Europe as they are almost everywhere else in the world than in North America. But America is an increasingly diverse place. There isn't just data that proves this, but also American media. You could be in Midtown Manhattan, surrounded by people speaking corporate English, but go to a certain part of Queens and the signs won't even be in the Roman alphabet anymore. The store signs will be in languages from different continents. For some people, changing boroughs in New York is as annoying as going through customs in the airport. Well, fine. Just go into any ethnic restaurant or line up at the halal or empanada cart to experience the cultures that were once not a part of the American zeitgeist. You don't need to cross borders in the US to feel transported to a new place. I've been fortunate enough to travel a lot this past year, and I'm not immune to the marketing ploy that Europe is better than the US. Architecturally, Europe is more interesting than the US, but it's what we've been taught to think of as impressive and interesting. I also know that America is a racist, xenophobic, sexist place, but so is Europe. And yet, here I am. And there I was. I've had and witnessed racist experiences in both places, but I'm lucky enough that those experiences aren't going to be as bad as for people who are in more marginalized communities than I am. London is known for being one of the most international and diverse cities in the world, and it is. In the middle of my time studying abroad in Prague, I went on a trip to London, and I can't tell you how at home I felt there instantly over Prague. And I'm not just talking about the pretty, commercial, gentrified neighborhoods, I'm talking about the communities with racial minorities. Those neighborhoods made me feel at home instantly because it reminded me of the States. If you're curious about how I can enjoy living in a place where my existence was once illegal, I would suggest reading Empireland by Sathnam Sanghera, How Imperialism Shaped Modern Britain. I liked how Sanghera wove his own experiences about growing up as a Punjabi Brit in London and gave the historical context for it. He said he feels proud to be British despite imperialism negatively directly affecting his family. You can be on both sides of it. I'm not discounting any of the atrocities that have happened in the US or what the US government has done abroad, because the US doesn't always favor minorities, including people like me. Sanghera believes that you can be proud to be from somewhere and not agree with all the decisions the government has made in your lifetime and the lifetimes before, because that's so complicated. That issue's always going to be complicated. I would never consider myself to be a patriotic American or a patriotic Indian, because for me, those titles have a lot of hatred tied into the meaning of those words. But I feel lucky to be brown and American, and despite what I may believe about myself, this video is proof that I am proud of where I come from, just not in the way you might think. To me, it isn't hard to find culture in the US because I am the culture. As a brown person and as a person of color, you just attract it and you bring it into conversations because it's a part of you. But being American is also a part of me, and those two parts are inseparable. It's the new brown America, and therefore, America is culture. I never thought I would make such a nationalistic video, and I think this whole video is the epitome of do not bring that European nonsense into this ethnic household. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. This is something I heard here in the US. And this was before I studied abroad in Europe.